Another medium term historical or medium scale historical sense is, or sense of perspective, is the phrase worst recession since the Great Depression. We heard this a lot during the 2008 to 2010 recession. And you saw a lot of images like this in the media. The unemployment rate got up to 10%, and everyone thought everything was falling apart. So that was called the worst recession since the Great Depression in the press a lot of times, and anyone who spoke publicly a lot of times characterized it that way. And people blamed the president at the time for it. There were protests against the president, blaming him for the economic downturn. And that's what people always tend to do when there's an economic downturn. So the previous worst recession since the Great Depression was in 1982, and you saw the same pattern. So, and I just talked about how history doesn't repeat itself, but it often does rhyme. There's another saying that while it doesn't repeat, it does rhyme, and occasionally. And this is a good example of that. And it gives you some perspective when people are trying to manipulate the way you're perceiving history or perceiving current events in the context of history, as if they're trying to make something the biggest or the greatest or the worst uh, of all time. And history gives you a sense of what the perspective actually means. Like, is something actually the worst since whenever? Uh, maybe, maybe not. So, the Great Depression, which we're going to talk about in this class pretty soon, within a couple weeks, or less than about 2 weeks, is a good example because, if you're saying this is the worst recession since the Great Depression, well, how bad can bad be? What exactly does bad mean? What does worst mean? So the Great Depression could get pretty bad, and it was an order of magnitude worse than any recession that came after it. Obviously, that's why it was called a depression and not a recession. So that's an example of keeping your historical sense attuned to perspective in kind of a medium scale environment where people are trying to convince you of something or get you to think a certain way about something.